Histotripsy changed my life for the better because it's given me the knowing of more life. I know that every time I see my grandchildren, if I'd not followed the histotripsy trial, where would I be?
We are being very effective at controlling tumors, especially with pretty minimal side effects.
It's a miracle.
I mean, it was kind of mind-boggling.
I had no pain. There were no incisions.
This technology is likely to replace what we call standard treatment today.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Hannes, representing Peter Thiel's life science investment firm. And with me here today is Mike Blue, Chairman and CEO of HistoSonics. Great to see you again, Mike.
Likewise, Hannes.
So it seems obvious now, the success of HistoSonics, the fact this modality works, but it wasn't in the early days. And so what I hope we can explore in our conversation today is some more of the non-obvious insights about how this company was forged and some outlooks and some ideas about how to maybe rethink the future of the medical technology industry. Since not everyone might be familiar here today, what is histotripsy, and walk us through the origin story and the skepticism of the early days around its discovery.
You bet. So there was one of the questions we most commonly get is, what's the difference between this and high-intensity focused ultrasound, HIFU? And so as a group of ultrasound researchers at the University of Michigan, who back in 2001 were working in a HIFU lab, which is therapeutic focused ultrasound, which uses heat at the focal point to ultimately necrose and burn tissue. And they were approached by a group of pediatric cardiologists who wanted to know if you could non-invasively use high-intensity focused ultrasound to create a pin-sized hole in a pediatric septum to create a flow channel. And so knowing that thermal energy wouldn't work for this application, they literally inverted the way that HIFU was being done. And so they went out and bought an industrial size generator. Cavitation is something that's commonly used in industrial mechanics. And so went out and bought a generator 5 feet tall and ultimately inverted the way that HIFU was being done. So began to use incredibly high amplitude, Frankenstein strength amplitude with very short bursts of energy, thousands of pulses per millisecond per spot, and ultimately created the way to liquefy targeted tissue, and then coined the phrase in 2002, histotripsy, which in Greek is tissue and the crushing of tissue. And so ultimately that's what we're doing. We're mechanically destroying and ultimately creating a liquefaction that then gets naturally absorbed by the body. So they began to experiment all the different ways that you could apply histotripsy non-invasive through the body. When I started with HistoSonics, there was a very active program using histotripsy to do what those pediatric cardiologists intended to do. We were doing it in piglets, creating that flow channel in the septums of these small pigs. But ultimately began to experiment treating clots, both in the body for DVT, in the brain. We've got ongoing programs where we're treating ICH for thrombus in the brain completely non-invasively, to soft tissue, to solid tumors, and even created intellectual property at the University of Michigan to erode a kidney stone or a gallbladder stone into a fine dust. And so a lot of very compelling potential clinical applications when their work was discovered by a group of venture capitalists in the Midwest called venture investors, and they all agreed to build a company in the very end of 2009.
Now walk us through some of the early skepticism and the challenges that perhaps folks don't know about when they see the headlines today.
On and on and on and on. Success has definitely not been linear. And so one of the challenges, it's both the blessing and the curse, is you've got a non-invasive therapy that can be applied anywhere from a clot in the brain to a neurological disorder to a tumor, and then applied anywhere in the body. So where do you start? And depending on what type of physician you're speaking to or clinician or what type of investor you're speaking to, there's always pull to do something different. So focus was, I think, has always been a somewhat of a challenge for the company. Ultimately, was guided by one of the founders of the company, a urologist at Michigan, Will Roberts, to start in prostate and BPH. And so at the time, back in 2010, 11, 12, there was a lot of interest in medical technologies for BPH. Ultimately, though, that study treated 28 men in an IDE here in the U.S. did not lead to the outcomes that were desired. They didn't hit their primary endpoint. And so when I started in January of 2017, we had a investor syndicate that was tired. They were still running off a Series A that was, that round was done in January of 2010. So now 7 years later, so you had a tired syndicate. You had a clinical study in BPH that did not meet its primary endpoint. You had a new CEO, and you now had questions around, well, what is next? Is it enhancement of the product to do prostate and BPH, or is it something different? And I will say that when I started there, I think there was now growing skepticism that histotripsy could ever be delivered safely and effectively in the body and get a regulatory clearance. We had loads and loads of animal data and bench data treating all these different potential clinical applications. But I think the now gnawing question was, could we ever get an FDA clearance and design a product that would work safely in the clinic? Too good to be true. We hear that still today, almost too good to be true.
I do remember when we first met a few years ago when I made that first investment. It seemed to me, obviously, you could have a laundry list of the risks of why this may not work, but it seemed to me like it was all solvable engineering risk. And the really interesting long-term question is, medicine is this interesting sector in which it's one of the few markets where you can actually top-down calculate what your market size is, right? Patient incidence times price, and you eventually get there. As a consequence, I think a lot of thinking in this industry, in this sector, has been very constrained. It's almost too convenient to be able to calculate a net present value at each juncture of a data readout. And it's created this dogma around, well, if only I reach this milestone in this clinical study readout, then I deserve this valuation, and then eventually I get acquired for this price. And so I think the interesting question to consider, if you're thinking about building potentially generational company, is where in life science do markets turn out to be far larger than this modeling assumed, than people expected? And I think the clues to that sometimes lay within qualitative, non-obvious insights, being in the ORs, the cancer wards, and really thinking and feeling through the patient experience. To give some examples, I think maybe we can talk a little bit about some of the surprising palliative use cases as well that weren't originally considered. This idea that at the end of life for terminal illness, even if you're attempting to treat with curative intent, these patients are really sick. I don't know who has been to an oncology ward, but it's emotionally heavy at times, right? And forget the survival curves and these standard metrics that we all look at in scientific papers, but just what is the human experience there, and even the pain of a large tumor that patients go through.
Yeah, so there's a lot there. So when I started, we made the decision to pivot and pause the work we were doing in prostate and BPH specifically, and pivot to tumors in the abdomen, most likely liver, kidney, and pancreas, to be determined when we got the new team started. And so ultimately we landed on liver based on its significant unmet clinical needs. So now we're going to create a new category in cancer care. We're going to start in the liver. And, that was a challenge in itself for the reasons you just named. When you're defining a category, I think sometimes investors, whoever the audience is, wants to know what you're going to replace. I mean, it's very common to say, okay, here's the liver market today. Here's the value of that liver market. What part of that market are you going to replace? You're going to replace surgeries. You're going to replace microwave ablation. You're going to replace transarterial delivery of either chemotherapy or yttrium Y90, radiation therapy. What is it? Where are you gonna fall? And our reality was we're developing a new category we don't quite yet know. We think that we can be used in early stage patients and replace everything that was just mentioned, including at some point when we have enough clinical evidence. Don't know why you wouldn't want to replace surgery, especially if you're a patient, and start with something that's non-invasive, non-toxic, and without any side effects. That seems obvious. What we didn't know, though, when we're creating this category is you've got all these other use cases, some of which now I'm the most proud of. These patients who have metastatic breast cancer, there's more women in the United States and Europe who have tumors in their liver from their metastatic breast cancer than there are patients with primary HCC. And so the questions we got early on were, what are you going to do for HCC? Isn't that a market that's already oversaturated? I don't know, the survival rates, the 5-year survival rates are still less than 20%. So saturated, yes. Effective, no. But putting that aside, what about the women who are suffering from metastatic breast cancer and dying of their liver tumors? We don't talk about that because there's no solution for those patients. That's why we don't talk about that. There's no effective systemic therapies. There's no effective immunotherapies. The same is true with pancreatic cancer. My dad passed to pancreatic cancer. He didn't die of the pancreatic cancer. He died of his liver tumors because there's nothing for those patients. And so we're creating this category. And then I think you alluded to this. What about repeat treatments? You've got a paradigm shifting new category in healthcare and cancer care, where you've got a procedure that's completely repeatable. And again, it starts with the safety profile that's so unique because it's non-invasive, it's non-toxic, it has less side effects. If you think about, every one of you knows someone who's gone through cancer, and everything they've gone through is either invasive, toxic, or with massive side effects. And that's why you stop at some point taking new drug therapies, because it's too toxic, it's gonna kill you. John, who's in that video, who says it's a miracle. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer with liver tumors and a tumor in his kidney. Treated as he says in a longer version of that video, I'm the first person on earth to have 3 histotripsies. I've had my pancreas histotripsy, I've had my liver tumors treated, they're gone, and I've had my kidney tumor treated. That's why it's such a miracle for him. The reason he can do that, the reason he did do that, the reason that he demanded that physician actually right up the street from here do that, is because it's unique, paradigm-shifting safety attributes, non-invasive, non-toxic, and with very few side effects. And so what is the market of something like that? I mean, that was a real challenge for us. And so you didn't meet your primary endpoint in prostate for BPH, benign disease. Now you're in cancer, something far more complex, and you're telling us you're going to build an entire new category in cancer care. There was a lot to overcome there. There was a lot to convince investors on, for sure.
And there's 2 interesting points I'd love to double click on. One of them, you said, non-invasive. Isn't it obvious? I also remember we had a conversation right when you were starting to commercialize, in which you expressed that was probably the riskiest year for the company. So what was the disbelief around adoption? And why did that turn out not to be true?
So, and you had mentioned in your last question, palliation, and I'll get to that. So along this journey, how we're going to convince investors, how are we compelling investors to invest in this new novel, disruptive therapy, new category? There was a point where the story wasn't sticking. Histotripsy, it doesn't have a lot of stickiness. It's hard to remember. It's hard for patients. It's hard for physicians sometimes, for investors. If I could change the term, I'd change the term. But it is what it is. We do histotripsy, and so we had to keep that. The story of histotripsy and why it's so effective becomes almost too good to be true, and investors, I think, were not believing, and so we and if there are CEOs in the room, one of the best things we did along the journey was we pivoted our talk track, and we began to sell ourselves as a non-invasive surgical robotic company. We were going to complete the evolution of surgery from open to laparoscopic to minimally invasive robotic to single port to completely non-invasive robotics. We did that through the foundation of our company, which is histotripsy, but don't focus over here on that. focus on the fact that we're going to build a completely a very complex, maybe the most complex, sophisticated surgical robotic platform in the world, and we're going to sell a lot of those. There's going to be demand for a lot of those. Patients want non-invasive, non-toxic therapies, as do physicians. And so it worked. We went from raising money in the early days when we were struggling from like my Uncle Ed and friends and family to people like Fred Moll, who believed in what we were building and the potential of a non-invasive robot, maybe even to work in concert in the OR suite with a laparoscopic or endoscopic robot, or maybe even a Da Vinci robot. These robots can work in concert and parallel. So began to build confidence that we could actually sell these robots. And ultimately, I think our Series C, which was sort of the seminal financing, was built on the confidence that our company could sell these robots because there would be enough demand. But histotripsy, and back to your point, oh my God. I mean, we did a 40-patient study that if you were critical of the company and how we got to market, it's the lack of excitement around this study. It was very acute, just showing safety and short-term effectiveness, which philosophically was our strategy to get to market to start selling robots. But now it's out in the wild. Now you've just sold 30 robots within 90 days. They're getting installed. How are they going to be used in use cases that we can't replicate in animals and that we can't replicate in humans? So that was by far the riskiest part of this journey, was the first year of commercialization, where surgeons and interventional radiologists are going to use it however they deem fit. And a lot of those use cases were for palliations, patients with many tumors, large tumors, sitting on a bile duct, wrapped around a portal vein, up against the capsule. And we had done as much work as we could in animals to prove that we wouldn't damage those critical structures. Histotripsy was safer in some of those areas, but you don't know until you get into it. And I've said to our company many, many times, if all we ever did was palliation, sign me up for that. To change a patient who is suffering from cancer, and we see it all the time in these liver cancer, patients with liver tumors, and now we see it all the time, patients suffering from pancreatic cancer, the pain in their pancreas, the pain and discomfort in their GI system, the pain from their liver tumors. And when you histotripsy them and you turn this fibrotic, calcified tumor, large tumors, into liquefaction, I mean, it becomes pretty obvious. It's not obvious when you're trying to sell to investors, but it becomes obvious when you hear about the patient reaction. This liquefaction process reduces so much pressure, and that pressure is causing pain. And it allows for increased perfusion to these organs. That perfusion can create healthier liver function, healthier function of the organ, normalized bowel movements, things that they'll say they haven't had in months. And so the satisfaction of patients who literally get up from their procedure, tell their loved ones, oh my God, I haven't felt this good in months. Back to your question about total addressable markets. What's the value of that? Like, what's the value of a patient driving to a hospital the morning of who's actually excited to go get their treatment? Like, that doesn't exist. You don't want to go sit in a chemo chair. You don't want to go have radiation for your 30th time. You don't want to go have surgery. Our patients are excited to go have their histotripsy treatments.
It's very interesting you say that, because it's so rare to think about a new modality and technology in terms of actually creating awe, feelings of inspiration. And to double click on that, beyond palliative, of course, today, successfully physicians have treated with curative intent. Of course, HistoSonics is seeing a lot of success there. I think aside from the data and these outcomes, there's a lot of talk here about sort of brand, and I think you're not giving yourself enough credit for the term histotripsy and the framing around that. I think it's actually very catchy. But I've actually long had this criticism in biotechnology as a sector. There's so much obsession about data and technology and outcomes, we tend to forget brand. And brand is often the key to building an enduring company. I always joke that when Kymriah, the cell therapy, came out, when I first heard that word, I thought, is that in the next territory of Eastern Europe? I mean, who came up with this name? It's awful. In contrast, sometimes you do come across really memorable, catchy in this case, pharmaceutical brand names such as Ambien or Claritin, or Clear Your Nose. But it's very rare that we see this. And I think it's really important. It's imperative to think about this if you do have something that's potentially breakthrough, because this is how you achieve information spread and awareness. This is the key to breaking through the barriers and the circles as well of a more traditional medtech investment audience or talent pool too. But on to talent pool. Minnesota, when I first learned that you were based there, I had to admit, I'm originally from Europe, spent a lot of time growing up in Asia as well. I'd never been there. You know how it was? I was very surprised actually by how efficient the airport was. It was truly German efficiency.
It's a great airport.
Better than LAX. Over time I realized, wow, this is really interesting potentially as a geographic advantage. Do you want to just talk a little bit about how you've thought about crafting the culture of the company, whether or not this geography has been a challenge or a benefit at various points of time in the company?
So when I started in 2017, we had a dozen histotripsy engineers. This is a spin out of University of Michigan. These are the world's experts in histotripsy. We had a couple of other employees, but it was an Ann Arbor-based company. And the challenge we had from the onset was there's just not a big ecosystem there. So you're either recruiting from the university or literally you're getting resumes of people who had worked there years prior or who had interviewed prior. There's just not the ecosystem. But there was a lot of sensitivity to moving the company out of Ann Arbor. That said, it was a virtual company when I joined. We had a group of European software engineers there's 5 of them. Now we've got 30 of them based in Serbia. They are the best. They are absolutely the best at what they do. And so we had a group in Ann Arbor, myself in Minnesota, and we had this group of Serbian engineers. So even before COVID, we were working, we learned how to work virtually. And so the board had given me the option to either relocate to Ann Arbor or at some point, if it made sense, to build a company out of Minnesota. And the more you get to know Minnesota, if you don't know it, I mean, the ecosystem is second to none. I mean, you've got Boston, the Bay Area, and then just based on all the big med device companies who are based in Minnesota, and then the startup community and ecosystem. It's just an incredible place to recruit talent from any function across all functions. And so never had any pushback that we were going to build the headquarters out of Minnesota, but we've got a growing facility of histotripsy experts in Ann Arbor. We've now got a group in Madison where we've hired 40 people out of Madison, Wisconsin. We've got an office there. We've got almost 40 in Colorado. At some point, I think we'll have an office there. We've learned to work really well virtually and remotely, and we've got an incredible, we provide anyone, no matter where they are, no matter what office they're in, an incredible amount of flexibility. We believe that you should work where you're most comfortable working, wherever you can get your best quality of work done. So whether you're in Minnesota, Ann Arbor, Madison, and you show up 1 hour a day or never or every day because you love being in our facilities, we kind of treat everyone the same from that standpoint. We have the facilities to offer people a place to work, but we really feel like if we hire the best people around the world, if we hire great human beings who are amazing at what they do, everything else works itself out, and you let them work where they think they're most productive.
Right.
So it's worked. Minnesota's great. Not this time of year. We just had a foot of snow and it's 0 degrees getting on the plane this morning, so I'm happy to be here. But besides the weather, it's awesome.
Data. You mentioned another point earlier about having run that first key study and the outcomes looking quite good from that, or rather the safety readout. I'd like to double click on this point as well, because this industry runs on data. It's almost this cult-like mantra, just follow the data. Oncology is especially one of the worst culprits in that it feels like everything is so standardized. You measure tumor regression. You measure all these supposedly objective metrics against which you grade hundreds of potential therapies competing. And what I think this obscures a little bit is some non-obvious ways in which sometimes medical technology can be miscategorized or misunderstood. So what do we mean by that? If we think about ICD diagnosis codes, if we think about reimbursement codes, we've, as a society, de facto constructed an ontology of how we believe disease is, how it's modeled. This has created economic incentives for reimbursement, which is ultimately what enables companies to succeed financially, commercially, or not. Once these things are set in stone, they're very sclerotic. It's very hard to go back, even if you have a different view about the etiology of disease, to go and change them. When you're not only trying to create a new company and technology, but now, good luck trying to rewrite reimbursement or potentially clinical guidelines. So I'd love to explore a little bit, in the context of HistoSonics, what are ways in which you've been miscategorized? There's this perhaps interesting effect that not everyone might be aware of. That's almost a little potentially therapeutic-like with this technology. So I'd love to just touch on this theme of, what are the boundaries of classic medical technology, device-based interventions, versus more therapeutic, drug-like modalities?
I think I know what you're getting at. And so if there is a criticism of the company, we'll pick on the medical oncologists who are incredibly data-driven. They make their decisions based on data and an overwhelming amount of data relative to whatever systemic therapy they use or whatever the gold standard is and whatever cancer they treat. That's just not the way that a class 2 medical device is regulated. It's just not. And I don't make apologies for not working with the FDA on a PMA and doing the phase 1 and 2 studies. It would have taken us 5 to 10 years to do a randomized controlled trial in cancer, and I don't think we'd have a company. And so we benefited from the de novo process being declassified to a class 2 device and doing a fairly straightforward acute safety and efficacy study. The good news, we got to market. We sold a ton of robots. We've installed these robots, and it's literally changing the world of patients who have cancer and tumors in their liver, their kidney, and now their pancreas. But it still doesn't get us over this data hurdle. Quick plug for our website. Go to the website, HistoSonics.com. Watch the patient stories. If you leave here today and you're not a believer, go watch the patient stories. One of them, Marissa, towards the end of her video, she says she's got stage 4 metastatic breast cancer. Histotripsy is her only option. And her medical oncologist doesn't want her to have it because in the medical oncologist, and I'm not picking on medical oncologist, a little bit I am. The medical oncologist says to Marissa, I'm by the book. We're not doing this, I'm by the book. And she says, the book says, I'm gonna fucking die. Like, what do you do? And so I met a patient who came into our office recently. He said, Mike, his stage 4 pancreatic cancer, he said, the drug I'm on is killing me. He said, I got $50,000 in my HSA. I'm either gonna die with it in my HSA, or I'm gonna go have a histotripsy. And so, that's what these patients are up against. So data for who? And if you go listen to all these, literally video by video by video, you'll hear them say, I'm told I'm gonna die. Like what data? Who needs data? Like I'm going on social media, which by the way is gonna change if we get into like how this industry is gonna see massive change in the coming years. Most of our patients are self-referred because we don't have the data to compel a medical oncologist to move their stage 3 or 4 patient to go have histotripsy. These patients are going on social media saying, I had histotripsy, it was non-invasive, non-toxic, I went home that day and I feel freaking great. The emails we get, there's nothing more gratifying than emails from family members who say, thank you. My dad, my mom, my sister, brother had your treatment. They haven't felt this good in months. It has changed their lives. Don't know how long they're going to live. Doesn't matter. We were a family no longer traveling, planning for dad's death. We're now in Aspen skiing. We never thought he'd see that again. So we are committed. We've got an incredible group of investors who are very committed and convicted to building the clinical evidence we need to create a paradigm-changing new category in healthcare, both cancer and benign disease throughout the entire body. We're convicted to do that. We're fortunate that we have the financial resources to do that, but common sense does need to play a role in this at some point. And when you've got such a compelling therapy for patients who don't have any other options, it's hard to argue based on the safety profile they shouldn't be given that as an option. Is that where you were getting at?
That's exactly it.
All right.
And if we simply believed in the holy church of follow the data, I think we'd all wake up every day, take the Hippocratic Oath, call it a great day, and pat ourselves on the back and never try anything new, right?
That's right.
And so, of course, there's a robust plan to generate all this long-term outcomes data. But it comes to this really interesting point, I think, an observation I make as an investor about this industry, in that it's really important to question some of these mantras as an entrepreneur, because it's very easy to slip into this convenient thinking that, oh, if I just run another clinical study or just get a little bit more data, then suddenly the gates of funding will unlock. Then suddenly the FDA will be easier. Then suddenly commercial adoption will just go my way. Sometimes that's true, certainly in the therapeutics world. Other times, there's, I think, creative challenges to some of these assumptions that are really worth testing and thinking about.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. For us, it depends on the application. When we start doing brain treatments and neurological disorders, I mean, there's going to be requirements of the agency, but there are going to be conditions we're already challenging the FDA on to think very differently about. If it's a benign condition and you've got a non-invasive therapy where there's no toxicity and almost no side effects, and you're preserving critical structures within the body, why would efficacy need to be compared to whatever the standard of care is if those devices are invasive with toxicity and side effects? If we can eliminate all of those, what's the harm of having a repeat treatment in 6 months when the patients just go home that same day and have no hospital readmittances? The cost of having a therapy where you don't invade the body and don't damage critical structures of toxicity will far exceed anything that we're doing today that's invasive or toxic or with massive side effects.
Right. And even on the safety side, people tend to forget with traditional methods of intervention, bleeding risks, infection risks, it's not the panacea either. And so efficacy, long-term efficacy data aside, there's I think some really interesting points even today on the differentiation of the modality that really matter for adoption.
With a handful of minutes, I'm curious, what attracted you to us? We've talked about the things that we'd have to overcome. You invested, I would say, earlier. You invested prior to us having FDA clearance. And then Peter and his funds came along after. But I'm curious, what you saw in us that you believed in a company as early as we were, with such big aspirations.
I'm
sorry to put you on the spot.
I'm a little biased in favor of
someone who doesn't traditionally do med device investments.
We've actually we've done quite some life science over the past several years. A lot of it therapeutics, indeed. So companies such as Compass Pathways, who pioneered psychedelic therapies as a sector, and AbCellera, who discovered the first COVID antibody. You're right, though, in that overall not that much medtech. Why? Because of some of the constraints in thinking that I think sometimes are true. Sometimes you just need to have a slightly improved screw or implantable or something like that, and it's probably fit to be acquired, and that's the best means of distribution. But other times you do stumble upon these new modalities where they're much more difficult to build, probably a lot more capital intensive, but if you get it right, you really build a business. And I think we've forgotten as an industry as well that we're in the business of building businesses, not crafting assets to be packaged up and to be sold for a predictable multiple with some risk-adjusted return, and a bunch of them failing, and the math still working out in a portfolio sense. But to get to your question of what intrigued me and what created that early conviction, and actually I want to give credit as well to even your earlier investor base, funds like Lumira and venture investors and others who partnered with you and the company during all the early days. We met a little bit later. It was three things. One, certainly the modality, not negging what the risks are, but imagining what might be possible. Two, engineering-centric risk. It seemed to me like most indications and most of the technology work was solvable. Might have been a function of time and capital. There were a couple misses, but really fundamentally an optimization problem. Maybe for the exception of brain, where I was less sure because of potentially physical limitations with penetrating the skull with this modality. But now you figured that out too, or in the works.
Figured it out.
And then I think it was finally you as a leader and CEO. Very important for us, often forgotten, dismissed. This is all about teams too, not just assets. And the way you were thinking about building culture, your commercial experience, the fact you were thinking about the market early on when this was still just barely entering early clinical studies was very differentiated thinking.
Oh, thank you. Awesome. I will say we applied machine learning in our development phase very early, and it paid dividends to investors like you who are building not just companies to spin off, but building companies, not assets, but companies. If you're a CEO in the audience and you're not using enterprise AI across your business and in development, you're going to get run over really fast. It is unbelievable how much we can accelerate the development of our platform using AI, both in research and development and then across the organization. I was only turned on to it, the company only turned on to it a couple of months ago. It's going to revolutionize all sectors and industries, but I could see it being the most pivotal, revolutionary aspect of medical device for a very, very long period of time. If you're not using AI, the development of your product, I would strongly recommend you start as of yesterday. We are making progress on software applications in the brain, things that would have taken us months, quarters, maybe even a year, we're doing in days at this point. It's an astronomical difference. So just a plug there for AI.
I think it's a great place to close. The next 10 years, for those who think differently, should be very interesting for this sector. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.